First of all, let me wish everybody who is watching this video a happy Christmas. I am making this video on Christmas Eve. It is highly likely that I will be spending Christmas Day with my family, and therefore I think it is most unlikely that I will be publishing a video tomorrow. The only circumstance in which I think I may do so is if there's been some major development. For example, if the Ukrainian defense in Bakhmut collapses or something on that scale. But can I first of all say happy Christmas to everybody who's watching this video, and thank you for following me on my channel, and have and enjoy a good and peaceful and happy Christmas holiday. Now, let us return to our traditional topic on this channel, traditional topic for the moment, which is the Ukraine war. And again, the major battlefield continues to be, as it has been now for some time, in my opinion, ever since midsummer, it's Bakhmut. And there's been much more fighting apparently there. There's reports that the Russians have consolidated their control over a village called Kurdyumivka, which is somewhere to the south of Bakhmut, and which is an important location that needs to be controlled by the Russians as they seek to continue the encirclement of Bakhmut. Anyway, the Russians have been moving north from Kurdyumivka, and apparently there is confirmation from Ukrainian sources that the Russians have now taken control of another village called Andreevka, which brings the Russians closer, ever closer, to that position where they will finish the encirclement of Bakhmut. Now, I'm not, as I said, a military expert, but I understand that these advances are indeed significant. There's also been confirmation now from official Russian sources, the Russian Defense Ministry people in the Russian Defense Ministry, that the Russians are indeed deep inside Bakhmut itself, that they've almost reached the river area which bisects apparently the center of the town, which would put them right in the center of the town. You may recall that some weeks ago there were pictures showing that the Ukrainians had blown up some of the bridges within Bakhmut which connected the two parts of the town. So it seems as if the fighting in Bakhmut is getting ever more intense all of the time. And I would add that one of the Chechen commanders, in fact, as I understand it, the senior Chechen battlefield commander, fighting, of course, on the Russian side. In fact, the Chechens have been an important spearhead or assault unit in many of the battles that have taken place over the course of this conflict. Anyway, that particular commander has now spoken of the probability that the Ukrainians are going to surrender Bakhmut. I have to say that I don't actually believe that. It seems to me that the visit of President Zelensky to Bakhmut, or alleged visit of President Zelensky to Bakhmut, I personally believe that he was at least in the vicinity of Bakhmut, but I know that there's a lot of people who think otherwise. But anyway, the visit or apparent visit of President Zelensky to Bakhmut and his long comments about Bakhmut over the course of his visit to the United States, where, by the way, and in passing, I understand Congress has now approved the $1.7 trillion omnibus budget bill for next year. Well, I think that visit by Zelensky clearly signals that the Ukrainians are determined to make a last stand there, to fight to the bitter end in Bakhmut. And I discussed yesterday, in my long video yesterday, how they seem to be now fortifying some of the apartment buildings there and even establishing air defense posts on the roofs of some of these buildings, all of which indicate that they're determined to go on fighting for Bakhmut until the very bitter end. And I would add, by the way, that they are paying an enormous price, and that it's clearly becoming increasingly difficult for them to resupply their troops in Bakhmut. All the roads now, all the railways are either damaged or under the heavily shelled by Russian artillery. The Russians have now fleets of drones apparently flying over the skies in and around Bakhmut. Of course, it's sometimes not the best weather conditions for drones. It's winter, there's no doubt fog and mist and rain and all that. But anyway, the Russians are keeping observation of what is going on. And I've seen pictures of a Ukrainian convoy either trying to get into Bakhmut or possibly withdrawing from Bakhmut. And it shows pictures of devastated vehicles that were clearly caught in some kind of fire trap, that they were shelled by the Russian artillery, and which has suffered, as far as I can see, complete destruction. There's also, by the way, confirmation that one particular Ukrainian unit that has been fighting in Bakhmut, the 93rd Brigade, has now been completely withdrawn. Apparently it has suffered enormous losses and will have to be reconstituted in the rear, but it seems that fresh troops have been sent in to replace it. So Ukraine continues to throw troops into something which even Ukrainian sources themselves now refer to as the Bakhmut meat grinder. I hate that word, but it's being universally used now by all sides, and well, we see the outcome. Now, there has undoubtedly been fighting in the war in other places, and there's been some kind of missile or artillery strike on Kherson city, and this has been heavily covered in the Western media. I'm not sure why, by the way. Shelling of all sorts of places goes on all the time. Donetsk city gets shelled by the Ukrainians. There's, of course, the Russian missile strikes on the Ukrainian energy system. But the Ukrainians are trying to play up this Russian artillery or missile strike on Kherson city. I'm not convinced that it's going to make any big impact. And of course, already there are the rumors that they might have staged part of it themselves. Rumors which personally I discount. I'd like to see some much more concrete evidence of that before I believe them. It is hardly news that Kherson city is heavily shelled by the Russian military, and that the Ukrainians, after regaining apparent control of the place, have never been able to consolidate that control because the city is directly under the Russian guns. Anyway, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to discuss a very interesting article that has appeared by Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I gained information, I became aware of this article when it was incorporated in a circular email that the historian Geoffrey Roberts sends to lots of people. I'm one of those people fortunate enough to be one of the correspondents, one of the people who receives Geoffrey Roberts's emails, and this is where embedded within this email there was this article by Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin is somebody I've mentioned before. Way back early in the war, he wrote a piece called about the fact that industrial warfare has returned. He talked about the enormous expenditure of weapon systems by both sides over the course of the war, and he made it very clear that in this situation, the Russians appear to have an inbuilt advantage, certainly over Ukraine, but as it turns out, over the West as well, that the Russians are able to outgun, outproduce Ukraine by a massive margin. But even the West, the mighty West, is struggling to keep up because of the completely different philosophies of the military-industrial complexes of the two societies. Russia on the one hand, the West on the other. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin, who, by the way, has been a serving officer in the United States Armed Forces. We're told that he's retired, but he was for 20 years of service. He had 20 years of service, including 8 years as an armor officer with 4 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He spent 12 years working as a modeling and simulations officer in NATO and the US Army concept development and experimentation, and that this included a tour with the US Army Sustainment Battle Lab. So he's somebody with a lot of experience in what he's talking about. He is now in some way connected to the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, and I understand that his latest piece is written in connection with his latest piece, which I'm going to turn to in a moment, is basically connected to that institute, RUSI, as I will refer to it. Anyway, it's a very interesting piece, and before I read it, I'm going to say that to my mind, it strongly supports the analysis of the war, the direction of the war, discussed by Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, by Scott Ritter, who has appeared on our programs, former US Army officer, by Colonel Douglas McGregor, by others, including myself, military person though I am not, and of course by myself with Alex Christoforou on the Duran, and others as well. I don't want to just limit this to a small ring of people, but those are the ones who immediately sprung to mind. That this is a war of attrition, that Ukraine is losing that war, that there has never, in fact, been at any point a time when Ukraine has actually been winning, and the territorial gains that Ukraine has achieved over the last few weeks since it embarked on its various counteroffensives at the end of August have come at an unsustainable price. And as Brian Beletic in particular has repeatedly said, what those offensives have actually done in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region, they have actually overall weakened Ukraine, weakened its military position, and probably hastened over time its eventual collapse, its eventual military collapse. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin, who, as I said, unlike me, has massive experience in this area, massive expertise. This is what he says. I mean, I'm going to read extracts from this article. It's a fairly long article, but I'm going to discuss, I'm going to highlight some points and discuss a little bit more detail some of the things he says, and then I'm going to follow up with some rather interesting news that there's now been on other things. But anyway, this is the sort of thing he's saying. The opposing sides, Russia and Ukraine, have adopted 2 opposing strategies. The Russians are fighting a traditional firepower-centric war of attrition. Ukraine is pursuing a terrain-focused war of maneuver. In other words, the Russians are taking, are focusing on destroying the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians are focused on recapturing territory. And Vershinin then goes on to say these opposing strategies are as much a product of natural resource availability as a deliberate choice. As freezing ground ushers in the winter campaign season, both sides will follow their strategies into limited offensives. So far, both strategies appear to work. Ukraine has recaptured large swathes of territory, but exhausted itself during the fall offensive. It suffered frightful losses and depleted key stockpiles of equipment and ammunition. There is still capacity to replace losses and establish new combat formations, but these are rapidly withering. I believe that neither side will achieve spectacular territorial gains. He's talking about the winter campaign season. But the Russian side is more likely to achieve its goal of draining Ukrainian resources while preserving its own. Now, this is, of course, just to go back to General Surovikin's interview with Russia 1 television back in October. That is exactly what Surovikin said he was going to do. He was not going to embark on big offensives. He was going to grind the Ukrainians down. And that is what Vershinin is talking about here. And he says that Surovikin, the Russians, are likely to achieve their objectives, whilst it's becoming increasingly unlikely that the Ukrainians will. And now Vershinin goes into more detail and he discusses the Ukrainian strategy. Maybe it would be better to discuss it less as a strategy, but rather to discuss it as a kind of war concept. And this is what Vershinin says. The Ukrainians' terrain-focused war of maneuver is constrained by two factors: limited artillery ammunition and equipment production, and coalition considerations. Ukraine started the war with 1,800 artillery pieces of Soviet caliber. It's a huge stockpile of artillery. These allowed firing rates of 6,000 to 7,000 rounds a day against 40,000 to 50,000 Russian daily rounds. By now, this artillery is mostly out of ammunition. And by the way, in parentheses, much of it has been destroyed. And in its place, Ukraine is using 350 Western caliber artillery pieces, many of which are destroyed or breaking down from overuse. There's lots of confirmation about that, even in the Western media. Meanwhile, Western nations are themselves running out of ammunition. The US is estimated to produce only 15,155 millimeter shells a month. This constraint has forced Ukraine to adopt mass infantry formations focused on regaining territory at any cost. Ukraine simply cannot go toe-to-toe with Russia in artillery battles. Unless Ukrainian troops close to direct firefights with Russian troops, there is a significant chance that they will be destroyed at a distance by Russian artillery. And then Vershinin goes on to say Ukraine's second constraint is the coalition nature of its warfare. Since running out of its own stocks, Ukraine is increasingly reliant on Western weaponry. Maintaining the Western coalition is crucial to the Ukrainian war effort. Without a constant string of victories, domestic economic concern may cause coalition members, in other words, Western powers, to defect. If Western support dries up due to depletion of stocks, you're now talking about Western stocks, or a political will, Ukraine's war effort collapses for lack of supplies. In some way, Ukraine has no choice but to launch attacks, no matter the human and material cost. And he goes on to say, Ukraine built an infantry-centric army of highly motivated, conscripted troops with limited to no training. Now, there's been a great deal said about the kind of training that Ukrainian draftees are getting. Again, I find the best discussion of this, the one by Brian Paletic on the new Atlas. The training Ukrainian troops are getting, both within Ukraine itself and from its various Western allies, is simply nowhere near enough, nowhere near prolonged enough to train Ukrainian troops up to the necessary level that one would expect of soldiers that are going into battle. And then Vershinin goes on to say, that is to say, these highly motivated conscripted troops, how highly motivated they are, I'm not going to discuss. They support the core fighting force of the pre-war professional army and about 14 new brigades equipped with Western donated weapons and vehicles. On the battlefield, strike groups attack quickly, penetrating deep and fast, then hand over captured areas to draftees to defend. And this is exactly what the Ukrainians have been doing. I've discussed this in many places. They launch small piecemeal attacks. They try to send relatively lightly equipped troops on often light vehicles, try and infiltrate them through breaks in the Russian lines. And then, of course, that supposedly causes the Russian defenses to become unstable, and that then leads to the Ukrainians being able to carry out further advances still. And then Vershinin, this is slightly my variant of Vershinin's view, but I think the two correlate with each other. And then Vershinin says, this tactic worked well in areas where the shortage of Russian manpower prevented a solid front, such as in Kharkiv region, which is absolutely correct. I've discussed how there were very few Russian troops in Izium and Kupiansk and those places, probably around 1,000 Russian ground troops in total, acting as a garrison there. There were, of course, other Russian troops. There was the militias of especially the Lugansk People's Republic, and there were troops from the Russian Rosgvardia organization, but that is an internal control organization. It is not intended to go into battle. So there were relatively few Russian troops in that area, and as Vershinin says, Ukrainian tactics in Kharkiv worked well. But then he goes on to say this, in the Kherson region, where Russia had sufficient density of forces, this tactic resulted in large casualties and little progress until logistic issues, in other words, the difficulties of keeping Russian forces on the west bank of the Dnieper supplied across the Dnieper River, caused the Russians to retreat. So the Russians retreated for logistical reasons because they didn't see any purpose in keeping their forces stranded on the west bank of the Dnieper with all the enormous complexities of supply across a river that was 1 kilometer wide. But there was no Ukrainian breakthrough at any time over the course of the fighting west of the Dnieper in Kherson region. I've discussed that myself, and Ukrainian losses were horrendous. In fact, I've now read a report on what was it must be said, a pro-Russian channel, Telegram channel, which puts Ukrainian losses over the course of the Kherson offensive at the equivalent of 2 infantry divisions and 2 armoured divisions. In other words, around 10,000 men, or at least 10,000 men, and around presumably 300 tanks. Now, I think that is probably about right, by the way. I mean, I'm obviously not in a position to check out and corroborate the figures, but that does seem to me to be roughly about correct. And I should say, when I said 10,000 men, I mean 10,000 men, most of them killed or severely wounded. And Vershinin goes on to say that the Achilles heel of this strategy is manpower. Ukraine started the war with 43 million citizens and 5 million military-aged males. But then he goes on to say that now that total has been severely reduced. There's probably no more than between 20 to 27 million people within Ukrainian-controlled Ukraine. I've seen these numbers elsewhere. I'm not absolutely sure about them, to be honest, but I'm going to go with them for the moment. He says that 1 million have been drafted already, and many of the rest are either not physically fit to serve or occupy vital positions in the nation's economy. And he thinks, Vershinin thinks, that Ukraine might be running out of men. Well, that may be true, and I think actually the fact that the Ukrainians are struggling, apparently, to even replace the losses that they've suffered, instead of just building up new forces, that does rather point to that. And there are, by the way, also reports that whatever reserves Ukraine is now trying to build up, they're being sucked into the Bakhmut meat grinder and are being destroyed there. And in fact, I've seen a map which suggests that all Ukrainian professional or semi-professional military formations are now in the conflict zone, in the actual fighting areas, and that all Ukrainian units west of Kiev are now what you might call territorial defense units, so that Ukraine really isn't able any longer to build up brigades in its own rear, though I suspect it is going to try to do so probably in Europe and whatever. But anyway, I think that Vershinin is probably right. I think that the Ukrainians probably are running down on their available manpower reserves. But I think this is perhaps the one part of his thing which is slightly less certain than some of the other points that he's made. But he then goes on to contrast this with the Russian strategy. And the point is that the Ukrainians managed to make some gains by this infantry attack, light infantry attack approach, to some extent using armor, to some extent using armored vehicles, but that the price that they've paid has been in enormously heavy losses, both of men and material, and that this is almost certainly unsustainable. And the fact is that the Ukrainians have been compelled to do this, both to maintain morale, sustain morale at home, but also to sustain the support of their Western sponsors. And that's the problem. And the fact is that they're running up both of men and material by pursuing this strategy. So that's what he said about the Ukrainian strategy. Now he turns to the Russian strategy, or the Russian approach to the war. The Russian forces are limited by manpower, but strengthened by massive artillery and equipment stockpiles, enabled by a robust military-industrial complex. Whilst there have been numerous reports in Western media that the Russian army is running out of artillery ammunition, so far there's been no visible slacking of Russian artillery fire on any front. That is a point I have made before and on numerous occasions. And we've seen that Putin who, by the way, has just visited Tula, the center of the Russian military-industrial complex. It's a town near Moscow, or relatively near Moscow, which is the center of the Russian military-industrial complex. He's had a meeting there with CEOs of the Russian military industries, and of course he's talking about a major increase in Russian weapons production this year, which is going to be greatly exceeded by further increases in Russian weapons production next year. So there is no sign that the Russians are running out of weapons or are ever likely to do so. Anyway, Vershinin then goes on to say the Russian side has relied on a traditional firepower-centric war of attrition. The goal is to force an unsustainable casualty rate, destroying Ukrainian manpower and equipment while preserving Russia's own forces. Territory is not important. Its loss is acceptable to preserve combat power. It's a point made repeatedly by Brian Paletic at the New Atlas, that the Russians will always trade territory if doing so will preserve their forces. And Vershinin goes on to say, at Kiev, Kharkiv and Kherson, the Russian army refused to fight under unfavorable conditions and withdrew, accepting the political cost to preserve its forces. And then he discusses the fact that the Russians typically wage war with far more artillery than Western armies do, and certainly far more than the Ukrainians do. That this massive artillery is backed by massive quantities of drones, and that the Russian approaches, the Russian artillery pulverizes Ukrainian forces before infantry mops up the survivors. And that's exactly what we are now seeing in Bakhmut. And he also talks about the fact that the Russians are gradually repairing the problems that were created by the previous Ukrainian infantry attack approach. They built up their own infantry forces. They made it increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to carry out those kind of flanking attacks with infantry forces that had been so successful in the Kharkiv offensive, though already less so than during the fighting in Kherson region. And I would add, and interestingly enough, Vershinin doesn't mention this, but of course the Russians have done something else to counter these Ukrainian attacks, which is, of course, they built up these enormous fortified lines right across the battlefronts. So they're able to counter Ukrainian battlefield tactics. They've just developed attack mechanisms to counter these battlefield tactics, and this has enabled the Russians to continue their approach, which is an approach focused on attrition, on grinding the Ukrainians down, which is what Surovikin was talking about. And then Vershinin discusses the options for winter offensives available both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians. And he says this about the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians decide to launch a major offensive, they could do so in two places, in my view. The first is in the north, in the Kharkiv region, but limited to over the Oskol River, but limited crossings over the Oskol River generates the same logistical challenges the Russians faced at Kherson. I think that's again a bit exaggerated. The Oskol is not comparable to the Dnieper, but in fact we've already seen Ukraine making lots of attempts to continue offensives in this area, and they're now running into heavy Russian fortified lines, increasing numbers of Russian troops every single attempt by Ukraine to launch offensives in this area over the last few weeks has only resulted in massive casualties to Ukraine, and it is the Russians who are now gradually going onto the offensive in this area, gradually closing in on Kupiansk and possibly Liman as well. And then Vershinin discusses the other much talked about option of the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians have, and it's this. The second is in the south, to cut off the Russian land bridge to Crimea, eventually capturing the peninsula itself. This is unlikely to succeed. The Ukrainian army would be attacking in terrain ideal for Russian artillery. It could become a repeat of the battle at Kherson, but without Russian logistics difficulties stemming from a limited number of crossings over the Dnieper River. With just as little gain and the same heavy losses marked by whole mechanized companies being wiped out, endless scenes of ambulance convoys and new cemeteries all over Ukraine. He's talking about here the cost Ukraine paid for the Kherson offensive. I think the cost of any offensive in Zaporozhye region would be far greater. Not only would the Russians resist here in a way that they didn't in Kherson region for the reasons that Vershinin says, but it's also the case that the Russians have also built very heavy fortified lines in Zaporozhye region of a sort that did not exist in the area of Kherson region west of the Dnieper. And Vershinin goes on to say that the levels of attrition in an offensive towards going south to try to cut the land bridge would play right into Russian hands. The political pressure on the Ukrainian government to justify the losses taken from Russian artillery in Donbass by retaking territory elsewhere, as well as the pressure from the Western coalition, may drive Ukraine to this kind of attack, regardless. And then he talks about Russian options. And he talks about the fact that the timing of what the Russians are going to do depends on ammunition stocks, Russian ammunition stocks. I mean, I think this is actually a false issue. I don't think there's any question here. I don't think the Russians have any issue of ammunition stocks. But then he also says longer training for the reservists increases the effectiveness and reduces casualties, thus lowering political risk for the Kremlin. Ultimately, the pressure that the Russian leadership views as most important will decide the outcome. Will the pressure from domestic politics for a quick victory win out, or will military considerations favour delaying until the end of the spring mud season in March, April? So far, the Kremlin has gone with military considerations ahead of political ones, suggesting that Russia will launch only a limited offensive this winter. And I think that is probably, I've come to the view, by the way, that that's probably right, that the Russians are still building up their forces, that they're building up, that they're training their reservists. I've been now reading reports that the completion of the training of the Russian reserve forces that have been built up, this 160,000 man reserve force, will only really be completed around March, and that does put the timetable for the big Russian offensive back later than I'd expected. But there will, of course, continue to be Russian pressure, and I suspect that, I'm confident that between that period leading up to that big offensive, with that reserve force being brought to bear to launch that offensive in the spring, that the Russians will press on with a winter offensive, but it will be focused on clearing Donbass, taking Bakhmut, breaking Ukrainian resistance in Vuhledar, and then moving on to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And Vershinin then basically finishes by discussing the Russian options for future offensive operations. And he somewhat discounts the possibility of an attack on Kharkiv region. He says that would only be meaningful if the city of Kharkiv itself were taken, and that could only be done with heavy costs, so that the Russians are unlikely to do that. Capturing other areas west of the Oskol River would run into all kinds of problems. The area is heavily forested, therefore easy to defend by Ukrainian infantry, and so the Russians are unlikely to do that. They probably will want to move back to the Oskol River to re-establish that defense line that they were building up there. And anyway, Vershinin doesn't think that there's going to be a big offensive in Kharkiv region anytime soon. However, he thinks that a more likely area is Zaporozhye. And this is what he suggests. Zaporozhye front holds the most promise. The Pologi, Golai, Polye, Pakrovsky Railroad is ideally placed to supply a Russian offensive driving north from Pologi. Eventually capturing Pavlograd would allow the capture of Donbass by cutting off two major main railroads and highways, supplying the Ukrainian army in Donbass and attacking the Ukrainian army there from the rear. The open terrain is ideal for the Russian firepower-centric strategy and a chance to draw in and destroy the last of Ukraine's operational reserves, and further attract its manpower is directly in line with Russian objectives. This is the winter campaign, I should stress. And Vershinin suggests that the hard frozen ground would make new defensive positions hard to dig for the Ukrainians without heavy equipment, and the limited attack vicinity of Vuhledar could be a shaping operation to secure the eastern flank of this future offensive. So what Vershinin is basically saying is this: there won't be a big Russian offensive with these 160,000 men until the spring. There's little point in the meantime in launching a big offensive in Kharkiv over the course of the winter, because there's no point in doing that unless you take Kharkiv itself. Pushing back to the Oskol River line would make sense, and it's probably something that the Russians would want to do in order to stabilize their defenses in this area. But over the course of the winter, the focus will remain Donbass, and the most attractive option for the Russians is to advance in the Zaporozhye-Vuhledar area in force, finally achieving that objective which they've long, I suspect, wanted to achieve, which is to surround and break remaining Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And once that's done, over the course of the winter, the Russians will be in a strong position to advance all the way to the Dnieper River. That's not in Vershinin's piece, but I would add to it. And at that point, that would put the Russians in a very strong position to launch a major spring-summer offensive with these extra 160,000 troops that have been built up coming over the horizon. So that's Vashinin's piece, and I think it's a very, very important piece because, again, it tells us, gives us a sense from a military professional of the war. Now, we're seeing lots of military professionals, Vashinin, McGregor, Scott Ritter, others, Brian Beletic, they're all telling us the same thing, that this war is going to be won through attrition. And that's what the Russians are doing, and they're doing it successfully. They're building up their forces, they're grinding the Ukrainians down, exactly as Surovikin says, and the West has no real response to this. It can only send small amounts of equipment, or at least the amounts of equipment that it can send are nowhere close to the amounts that Ukraine would need in order to reverse this trend in the war. And in the meantime, continued resistance is causing Ukraine to suffer extraordinary losses, and the constant political imperative imposed on the Ukrainian military by its own political leadership and by Ukraine's backers in the West to constantly provide at least the appearance of victories is obliging the Ukrainian army to engage in attacks, offensives, which have no strategic significance, but are causing enormous losses and are weakening Ukraine and its ability to continue the war. Now, I have dealt with this article at length because it encapsulates my own understanding of the war. We have now multiple military professionals talking about this. Marinus, who was that anonymous person who wrote that piece for the Marine Corps, the US Marine Corps magazine back in the summer, he was another example of this. And I think that we have to start looking at what the military professionals, the analysts are telling us about this war. Note also something else, the actual concern and regard that Vashinin has for the fact that the Ukrainian army is suffering these enormous losses. And this is true of all of the people, all of the other military professionals that I've been talking about. By contrast, when you go to the Western media, when you follow Western commentary, all they're concerned about is Ukraine's apparent victories, its supposed successes, the embarrassments that the Russians suffer from time to time, that these embarrassments invariably turn out to be minor pinpricks of no very great significance, and there's no discussion about the price Ukraine and Ukrainian society are paying for these so-called victories and for all the territory that has been regained in this way. There's no point, as I said previously, in calling the defense of Bakhmut, which has lasted all these months, a Ukrainian success if the Ukrainian army is being weakened in the way that it is and making it easier eventually, once Bakhmut is captured, for the Russians to achieve their geopolitical and strategic objectives. So there we are. We have an accumulation of people with the necessary expertise, all pointing and talking about the same thing. They're all highlighting the vulnerabilities, the weaknesses of Ukraine's strategy, the extent to which Ukraine is waging an industrialized war which neither it nor the West is ready for, against, well, to be straightforward about it, a Russian military juggernaut, a military industrial juggernaut, capable of pouring out missiles, shells, tanks, guns, drones, all of those things, because Russian society and the Russian economic system, for all that their many flaws and weaknesses, are geared to do precisely that. Anyway, I spent a lot of time on this topic. I think Vashinin's article, which, by the way, was published on the third, is dated 30th of November, but which seems to me fully up to date. I think it gives as good an overview of the state of the war as any. I'm going to just finish with a few more subjects. Now, again, I've constantly peppered with questions about the weakening, the softening of the ruble that has taken place over the course of December. I've said many times that I find this whole subject of the softening of the ruble, every so often, every couple of years, we have situations where the ruble strengthens and then the ruble weakens again, and all sorts of excited commentary appears about this. And I've always said that it is of no particular significance. But I'm just going to add just a few things about this, just to sort of round up some of the things that I've said. Now, I should say that over the last couple of days, the ruble seems to have stabilized at around 70 rubles to the dollar, which is actually still stronger than was the case before the war. It may go up, it may go down. I'm not going to speculate, but I doubt it will go up or down very much. And if it does, well, the Russian central bank has repeatedly shown that it has all the means necessary to defend the ruble. It is not as if the situation that Russia faces today is anywhere near as critical as it was in February, March, when the Russian government showed, the Russian central bank showed, that they had the ability to defend the ruble. The obvious way to do it would be by putting up interest rates by, say, half a base point. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that further. Let me just say a few things. There's been some explanations about what has happened. Firstly, I do want to come back to that mistake I made some days ago when I said that the ruble probably softened because of the fall in Russian oil exports and the price gap. And to repeat again, that article in Bloomberg about a collapse of Russian exports, oil exports, is untrue. There have now been comments about this from none other than, no less a person than the Russian energy minister, Novak, who says that Russian oil production is stable and that Russia's ability to continue to export its oil is essentially undiminished. And I have no doubt that that is correct. So we can put that issue to one side. It might have had some, shall we say, marginal effect in causing the ruble to fall, but it wasn't the underlying one. Now, there have been two pieces of news which have been interesting. Firstly, we've had a report from the Russian Central Bank. Now, this is about the state of Russia's international reserves, its foreign currency reserves. Now, if you remember, before the conflict began, back in February, Russia's reserves stood at around $630 billion. And that the Western powers took the extraordinary and radical step of freezing those central bank reserves. And we were told for a long time that $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves had been frozen in Western countries. Then a couple of months later, we heard that, in fact, the Western powers had only been able to track down around half of that amount, and that the actual amount of central bank reserves, Russian central bank reserves that had been actually frozen, was no more than about 150 billion, not 300 billion. And then we heard nothing more about that story for many months. Though about a couple of weeks ago, there was again an admission that, in fact, the Western governments have only found around around 1/3 of the Russian central bank's reserves, and that approximately 2/3 of them they've never been able to locate, and there's now a suspicion that the central bank has quietly sold them on to third parties. I'm not going to discuss that. That begs all kinds of very interesting questions if it's true. But what has been true is that for a long time, the Russian central bank gave us no information about the state of its foreign currency reserves. Well, it's now starting to do so again. And on the 22nd of December, we had this very interesting news. Russian international reserves, as of December 16th, amounted to $581.7 billion, increasing by $5.2 billion over the previous week. And the report that came through is that the volume of international reserves as of December 16th, this is from the central bank, amounted to $581.7 billion, having increased over the week by $5.2 billion under the influence of a positive revaluation. Now, that does seem to corroborate, to some extent, these reports that the Russian central bank was actually able to hold on to more of its supposedly frozen reserves than had been thought. But it also seems as if the Russian central bank has been able to buy foreign currency over the course of 2022, so that its reserves now are not that far short of, well, they are far short, but not so far short of where they were before the conflict began. So before the conflict, they were 630 billion. Now they stand at around 580 billion. And of course, they may rise again. They may rise again over the course of the coming year with the rise in the oil price. Now, it seems that over 1 week in December, the reserves increased by over $5 billion. Now, I do wonder whether a positive revaluation is the whole explanation for what happened. Could it be that, in fact, over the course of December, the Russian central bank, for some unknown reason, at least unknown to me, started buying foreign currency again? Interesting to know, if it did, how it was done, but perhaps that was what it was doing, and maybe that was what put downward pressure, one of the factors of what put downward pressure on the ruble. In other words, that the central bank is building up its war chest, it's building up its reserves. I'm not sure to what purpose or for what end, and I'm not sure how it's done, given the fact that it is under sanctions. But anyway, it does look as if it's been gradually able to rebuild its reserves, and all the indications are that it is continuing to do so. So that's just one reason why the ruble might have come under pressure in December. The Russian central bank might have been selling rubles to buy foreign currency, to build up its reserves. That would have caused the ruble to soften. As I said, I don't know how it's done, but that might be one possibility. But there is another one, and it's been provided by the Russian finance minister, Anton Siluanov. And it's a very interesting one. He says that the principal reason why the ruble softened in December is because there's been a rise in imports. Russia has been buying more imports. Now, that would cause the ruble to soften. But if that is indeed the case, then an increase in imports into Russia is a very strong sign of a gathering economic recovery. One of the reasons why imports collapsed is because, obviously, sanctions were imposed, all sorts of companies, Western companies, pulled out. There's been less goods, therefore, traveling into Russia. and that has caused imports by Russia to fall significantly over the course of 2022. But it's also been the case that throughout 2022, there has been a major fall, a major decline in demand within the Russian economy. And this has been a major concern by Russian policymakers. And if imports are now rising, that suggests the demand within the economy is becoming stronger, which points to an economic recovery, an economy going back into expansion. Now that could potentially cause the ruble to soften. If that is the case, then all I would say is the softening ruble is, in that case, quite possibly a sign of growing economic strength. I'm not sure what all of the, that we or anybody apart from Siluanov, Nabulina, the central bank chair, a number of people, other people like that, have the whole story. They know the whole story. I don't pretend I do. I don't want to speculate further. But certainly, there is no indicator of any kind of crisis in the Russian economy. And if what Siluanov says is true, it's likely that, on the contrary, as I said, the economy is getting stronger rather than weaker. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Now, there is another point I want to make, which is on a completely unrelated topic, and that is about the Polish build-up, which I discussed a couple of days ago. And I received a very interesting email about this. Again, it's a private email from somebody who clearly does know what he's talking about. And he makes the point, and I think it's an excellent point, that the Poles may be concerned that in the event of a Ukrainian military collapse, in the event of Russian advances close to the Polish border, there would be a real risk, even if the Russians had no intention of advancing into Poland, of some of the fighting spilling over into Poland. Ukrainian troops, for example, might want to retreat into Poland itself, and that might cause the Poles all kinds of concerns and difficulties. So that would be a good reason for Poland to strengthen its defences, to try to secure its border. And I have to say, that does seem to me a powerful argument, and one which I'm prepared to go with, at least up to a point. What I would say about that is that if that analysis is true, and I found it persuasive, then it suggests that the Poles, who are certainly very well informed about the situation in Ukraine, are probably becoming increasingly concerned about Ukraine's overall position. And if they're starting to make what look to me to be contingencies preparing for a Ukrainian collapse, well, that in itself is a major indicator of the way things are going. Anyway, that is me for the day. This is the point where I finish. Thank you for joining me once more. As I said, have a very happy Christmas. And in the meantime, remember, if you want to see all our videos, you can find them on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You should check out our shop and look at the great things there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those amazing things. And last but not least, please don't forget to check your subscription to this channel, and if you've liked this video, to press the like button. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me after the Christmas holiday, and for the last time from me today, let me wish you all a very happy Christmas and a good and happy time with your families.